Hello, Diet Soap viewers, listeners, and future readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this Critical Cuts video, I'll be tackling two related topics. The first is the idea of a boring dystopia, and the second is Guy Debord's notion of the spectacle. I'm tackling this topic of a boring dystopia because a Zoomer friend of mine suggested it. Apparently, the idea is relatable to a certain set of very online Reddit users and basement dwellers. In other words, it's popular with the fan base. But I'm also tackling this topic because I've wanted to re-theorize the situationist international, rethink the idea of the spectacle for probably a decade now, and this idea of being bored as the world collapses seems to me to be a good place to start. Another friend of mine, a blogger named Xenogothic, recently wrote about boring dystopias in an essay entitled Peak Boring Dystopia on the Legacy of Farmville. He wrote, "The point is always made that capitalism is efficient. People say, you might not like it, but it works. But Britain is not efficient. Instead, it's stuck in a form of frenzied stasis." This quote is deceptive in its simplicity. Just what would count as efficient from Xenogothic's point of view? And why is remaining in a state of equilibrium necessarily inefficient? Is the problem we need to address inefficiency or boredom? In this video, I'll try to explain just what this capitalist stasis, or boredom, is. Point out how it's related to the contradictions and real inefficiencies intrinsic to capital, contradictions that the late Marxist theorist Moïse Pastone claimed created a treadmill dynamic, and then explore how the economic foundation of capitalism becomes or became the prevailing ideology Debord called the spectacle. If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and click that bell. You should also consider supporting me on Patreon. Patrons get access to a second behind-the-scenes parrot room discussion where we dish out gossip or go into the weeds on topics such as the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, imperialism, and the critical theories of Tiffany Brissett and Donald Most. You'll also get access to both the public and private version of the revised Pop the Left series with Ashley Frawley and Pascal Robert, and the new Zoomer Philosophy series. Your support will not only make content like this possible, it will also help to establish a new publishing venture through Diet Soap Media. Right now, supporting me on Patreon will make a big difference. There are two approaches, two paths toward the idea of the spectacle as a now boring dystopia. The first is through philosophical speculation, and the second is through Marxist politics. The philosophical approach tackles our boredom as a problem of consciousness and separation from life. From the perspective of the philosopher, our boredom arises from the inauthenticity of our lives, our failure to bring together our inner or subjective desires with our concrete lived experiences. Our boredom is the affect of our phoniness, or the way in which we have lost hold of ourselves and become passive spectators to a world that is always out there, always beyond us. From the perspective of the philosopher, the trouble is our alienation. We are merely observers of a world of objects, and as passive observers, we become objects ourselves. There are many words that describe this condition of being an object in the world, many ways to understand what it is to lose oneself in a world of frenzied stasis. A person who has no agency might be called a consumer. That is, they could be defined by how they take the world of objects into themselves without transforming it. The consumer becomes the same as what he consumes and leaves behind only waste. Another way to think of what it is to be an object, or objectified, is to consider the German word Alltäglichkeit, which roughly translates to common, or mundane, or everyday. When we are dominated by the objective world, we, as Heidegger might put it, lose our distinctly human character. We give up on ourselves as self-conscious and self-realizing beings, confronted with mortality and personhood, and become other-directed. We abandon the authentic, self-generated projects we've developed after being thrown into this objective world, and instead become just another member of the herd. To get the full sense of the nightmare quality, or the potential for nightmare, that this process of becoming an object could involve, we can turn to the science fiction movie Terminal Man.
That's interesting.
What's interesting?
It feels like I'm eating a ham sandwich.
In the Crichton novel and film by Michael Hodges, a character named Harry Benson, played by the late George Segal, is suffering from seizures. An epileptic, he suffers from blackouts wherein he continues to act, but without conscious understanding or control. While he's blacked out, Harry becomes unpredictable and violent. In an effort to cure him of his seizures, his doctors suggest an experimental procedure wherein electrodes will be implanted into his brain that will both detect an oncoming seizure and send electrical impulses to suppress it. But instead of overcoming his blackouts, the procedure overcomes Harry. Rather than gaining control of his mind for himself, Harry becomes the puppet of others, and his seizures both. He spins out of control and into a permanent state of blackout. Harry Benson is erased. He becomes either the puppet of others or a random, jerky, killing machine. But at least this story is exciting. The reality of our everyday life existence is that it is mostly routine, sterile, and boring. In his book, The Society of the Spectacle, the French radical theorist Guy Debord wrote about boredom in the middle of the 20th century, the boredom that has perhaps continued until today. He described what he called pseudo-cyclical time in theoretical terms, and then pointed to how in advanced sectors of capitalist society, time itself is a marketable commodity. He pointed to tourism, theme parks, and subscriptions to what he called cultural consumption as examples. One has to wonder what he would think of Tinder. But Marx sees units of commodified time as being part of the spectacle is the way life is kept at a distance, as if behind glass. Without intimacy or community, people congregate with strangers in order to experience the world as a series of mere images. Debord holds on to the possibility of connection, of responsibility. He's not arguing that we are condemned to a pseudo-reality or to the spectacle. We aren't caught up in hyper-reality, as Baudrillard would put it, because the stasis of pseudo-cyclical time, the feeling of endless repetition, is contradicted by the linear time that defines capitalist production. Debord wrote, "The production process's constant innovations are not echoed in consumption, which presents nothing but an expanded repetition of the past. Because dead labor continues to dominate living labor, in spectacular time, the past continues to dominate the present." This description of how we're stuck in an eternal present, stuck in an apparently unchanging world, is familiar. It was echoed later on in the works of Mark Fisher, but even more, it is my lived experience. However, what we should notice is that for Debord, the progressive aspect of capitalism is the material realm. The realm of production and exploitation is real, and it really does move. Innovation occurs in the factory, in finance, in the home studio, even as it never occurs in our personal life. In a world wherein relationships between people are mediated by things, and the relationship between things are social, only dead, inert commodities can live. However, what should be remembered is that this sense of innovation, of progress, of movement, that seemed real to Debord, is itself a product of the social relations and production, along with the forces of production. As the Marxist theorist Moishe Pistone argued in his book Time, Labor, and Social Domination, quote, Marx's theory of history, his notion of an immanent logic of historical development, is not transhistorical and affirmative in his mature works, but rather is critical and refers specifically to capitalist society. Debord believed that historical time, irreversible time, is natural and naturally exists for humanity. We merely need to grab it. Whereas for Pistone, this irreversible linear time is itself a product of capitalism. Further, Debord writes about the spectacle as dominating the workers. He talks about this static, repetitive, boring time as having colonized society through political imposition. Whereas if we realize that this boredom is our own product, that collectively we are choosing it and reproducing it, we are both left without excuses for delaying revolution, and also with no clear understanding of the cause of our own inactivity, our own passivity. Debord wrote that the world was already dreaming of living in real time, already dreaming of a life lived without alienation, without mediation, through an objectivized structure that stands apart from the wills and desires of us, the living. However, a life lived without alienation, without mediation, would be unstructured. To believe that such an unstructured existence could be possible requires a leap of faith. It requires that we believe in some transhistorical structure or force that we don't have to build or reproduce, but rather that is already there as either the natural order or as our own nature. Instead, it seems that our real task is not to realize this dream of an unalienated life, but rather to risk alienating ourselves in a new, different way. Guy Debord was an anti-Bolshevik. He was, like Cornelius Castoriadis and Henry Lefebvre, writing in a moment when really existing socialism was found wanting. He was writing when the turn away from politics and the invention of the New Left were both well underway. Today we are faced with the need to return to an acceptance of alienation. We need to embrace a certain kind of boredom, the kind of boredom that is always experienced when one encounters problems and difficulties that are not immediately accessible or solvable. As Andre in My Dinner with Andre said, we're bored now. We're all bored now. But there are different kinds of boredom. There's the boredom of the oversatiated, the boredom for those who experience the world as an endless amusement, and then there's the boredom that must be fought against, must be overcome. The boredom we face when we encounter a world or political situation that resists easy solutions. We're bored now. We're all bored now. Good.